So this is a great honour to be here to the Hay on Wye Festival in the South Coast. But I've been asked to talk about 12 short story writers in, or 10 rather, in 10 minutes, which is a bit of a difficult task, so forgive me if I overrun. But let's get cracking. First of all, Edgar Allan Poe. He's probably the first short story writer we know of. And he was the first person, really, who tried to make a living out of writing. A lot of people wrote as secondary activity. He tried to make a career out of it. And he was actually born as, named as Edgar Poe. But he was abandoned by his father when he was 1, and his mother died when he was 2. And he was then fostered with a family called Allan. And that's how he joined the names. But actually he didn't get on very well with the Allan family. He then went into the army, and he didn't quite graduate from West Point. We don't quite know why. But he turned to writing. He wrote initially poetry, but then he started to do short stories. And he is really the first person well known for short story writing, but also for detective stories and stories of mystery and imagination. His 2 most famous stories, I think probably, are The Fall of the House of Usher and The Murders on the Rue Morgue. So that's my first one. Second, Guy de Maupassant, right? He wrote about 350 stories in all. He was brought up in Normandy, and his family knew Flaubert quite well. So he was actually a bit of a protege of Flaubert's. And he also went into the army, and he graduated in 1870, just in time to fight in the Franco-Prussian War. And that really put him off war, the effects of war, and particularly the effects on civilians. And through Flaubert, he also had developed a rather cynicism of French society, and particularly its hypocrisy at the time. His most famous story is called Boule de Suif, or Ball of Fat, and the Ball of Fat is actually a woman, and she gets caught up trying to cross the lines between the Prussians and the French, and she is lusted after by a Prussian officer. But it develops into a whole story of hypocrisy. And it's a fascinating story. It was actually the first short story that he wrote, but it made his name. And he continued writing for, as I say, 350 stories or more thereafter. Now, O. Henry, right? You know O. Henry? No. Okay. O. Henry was born William Sidney Porter. Okay. His mother died when he was about 3, and he and his father went to live in Texas, and he grew up there. He went to work for a bank in Texas, in Austin.
When are we talking for?
Sorry, we're talking about late 19th century. Sorry, 1880s. Sorry, these are all in chronological order. So, sorry, I should have said that. He was indicted for embezzlement at the bank, and the night before he was due to go on trial, he fled and went to Honduras. He had been writing while he was at the bank. He continued writing when he was in South America or Central America, and he was the first person to use the phrase "banana republic." But he returned back to America, spent 5 years in Ohio Penitentiary, and then went to New York. And that's really when he developed the name O. Henry, and because he didn't want anyone to know from the past. And he used to write mostly for local newspapers in New York, and also for magazines, Collins and Harper's and so on. He used to go into public places or into hotel lobbies and watch people, and then try to create stories about them. And just like Guy de Maupassant, he also had a little twist at the end of the story. That's what he's famous for. And he wrote, sorry?
That's very funny.
Very funny. And he wrote about sort of low society, sort of hobos, policemen, shop assistants, clerks, at a time when people were trying to pretend that American society was just as important as senior and sophisticated as European society. He didn't. He wrote, and these are wonderful stories. And I urge you to read the first one, The Gift of Magi, because if you read the first one, you will want to read the other 100. Okay? Next one. Who does not know? Who does not know this picture? You don't?
Yes.
Of course. I think everyone knows it. Okay. This is a special favourite of mine. The interesting thing is that actually Kipling did the drawings himself, and he read these stories. He composed these stories for his daughter Josephine. Now, sadly, both Kipling and his daughter contracted pneumonia, and whilst Kipling survived, I'm afraid his daughter did not. But when he was reading these stories to her, she always used to say, "Now, Daddy, I want you to read these stories just so, just so." And that's where the phrase comes from, just so stories. What is interesting about this particular book is that they were published in 1902. This comes from a series of Kipling's books. We have a great length of them at home, okay, published in 1903. So this book is 113 years old. So that's quite special. Very precious. Okay, Dr. Doyle. All right. Brought up in Edinburgh. His father was an alcoholic. His mother was a great teller of stories. And so that really sort of gives the story of their coming from an Irish family, although they had lived in northern England and Scotland for some time. He qualified as a doctor and was tutored by a man called Joseph Bell, very well known for his ability to make deductions from his observations, and was eventually, of course, the subject of Sherlock Holmes. So Doyle actually came to practice here in Southsea, and fortunately for us, as a doctor, he was a complete failure, and he sat in surgery all day waiting for someone to come. I don't think Southsea was a very sensible place to set up a practice, because although it might have been cheap, okay, nobody could afford to go to a doctor in Southsea. So he sat there writing, which was his great passion. He really liked to write historical novels, but which I have to say I don't think are very good. But in 1889 he wrote Study in Scarlet, and then the Strand magazine asked him to write some short stories based upon the character of Sherlock Holmes in the Study in Scarlet. And his first story was The Scandal in Bohemia, written in 1891, and he continued writing about Sherlock Holmes until 1927. Although, of course, as we well know, there was a break in the middle because he killed off Sherlock Holmes because he got a bit fed up writing. I mean, trying to produce a story once a month, is very, very difficult. So, and a complex plot, which he had to do for the Strand magazine. So he killed off Sherlock Holmes, but the great thing about his writing is that he was so incredibly popular. He brought reading to the general public as no other person did. He was a sort of kind of J.K. Rowling, except in short stories, of his generation. Everyone read him. And that is why, in my opinion, he is so important in English literature. Okay. Saki. No one can talk about short story writing without Saki. Now, H.H. Munro was born in Burma. His father was in the Burmese civil service. His mother died when he was quite young, and he was sent to stay with aunts and godparents and grandparents and so on in North Devon. And it seems that they were a fairly difficult and authoritarian bunch of people. And I think that's where he developed this sort of hatred, really, almost, of rather overpowering adults. Now, one of the things that I think about is really interesting about him. He only started writing in 1901, and died in 1910. So he wrote exactly in the Edwardian period. Okay? Now it's actually it's not so difficult to make observations about society of 20 or 30 or 40 years before. We could talk about, well, you wouldn't, but the rest of us could possibly talk about the 60s and 70s. Okay? But to actually write stories which depicted society in the 2010s, I think we'd struggle a bit. But he did that. He had two characters, Clovis and Reginald, who made observations about society at the time. His two most famous stories, in my opinion, are Schredenbachler, which I think we all know, and depicts his hatred of aunts and so on. The other one is The Unrescue, which really showed up some of the emptiness of Edwardian societies. But always got a punchline at the end. I love Sadi. He's rather evil, as you can see from this, but I love him. Okay. Somerset Maugham. Okay, another doctor. He was also orphaned when he was 10. It's extraordinary, isn't it? He was also orphaned when he was 10. He was brought up by members of the family. He had a rather unhappy childhood. He was bullied at school. And I think this made him sort of develop a slightly sort of sour, acid kind of view of the world. He behaved that way, actually, until his death. He studied medicine at Thomas's Hospital, wrote his first book called Liz of Lambeth, because through his experience as being a doctor in that part of the world. He made then quite a lot of money out of writing plays and novels and so on and so forth. And then after the First World War, he went on travels around Asia. And most of his short stories are around about Southeast Asia. And my wife and I have been lucky enough to go and visit some of the places, stay in some of the hotels that he did. The Raffles in Singapore, the E&O in Penang.
Just be careful.
Be careful. Well, shall I do this?
I'm handing over.
Okay. So he was a bit of a naughty boy actually, because he used to go and stay with people. He used to go and sponge on people extensively in Asia, and then he used to write rather acid stories about them. And he became extremely unpopular as a result. And well, I have to say, in the end, he went to live in France, so nobody could get at him.
And would you pick Rain for him?
Sorry?
What story would you pick for him?
Footsteps in the Jungle. And there's a reason for that. It has a wonderful description of Malacca. He calls it Tanah Merah in the book, which means Red Hill. But when we were living in Singapore, I used to have to go to Malacca quite often. And his description of Malacca, the English club, the Padang, tall trees, is absolutely magic. So I love it for that alone. But yes, Rain, I could pick out many short stories of his. Okay, Ernest Hemingway. You probably don't think of him as being a short story writer, but he had a rather unfortunate experience, apart from the fact that he was wounded in the First World War. But he returned to Paris in the early 20s and fell under the spell of Gertrude Stein. But he wrote quite a lot of short stories, and one day he sent it, I'm not quite sure why, but he sent his wife off with a suitcase full of 80 to 90 manuscripts. And she lost this suitcase in the Gare de Lyon. So, I mean, he was absolutely, amazingly, he didn't actually divorce her, but he divorced, not at that time, but of course he got through 4 wives and a lot of mistresses in total. But probably his most famous short story is The Snows of Kilimanjaro. But there are many others. Of course, he's most well known as a novel writer. But of course, the thing about him, I always feel, is he was a correspondent. But a lot of the time when he was writing for the Toronto Star, he actually didn't tell the truth. He told a story. And when he was writing novels, very often they were quite autobiographical. particularly the aspects of drink, which sort of seem to go a theme through all his stories. But he was a giant of the early 20th century writing. He had a particular technique which he called the iceberg theory, that in 1/8 of the storytelling, you write very factually, da 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 da, short sentences, okay, very factual. And the idea was that you wrote them so your readership would imagine the other 7/8 of the iceberg. So that was his theory. Anyway, he died in 1961, quite of old age. In fact, he shot himself. He was being chased by the FBI at that time for being a Soviet spy. And drink had taken over as well. He was in a pretty poor health. So this is probably one that you haven't heard of, right? He's a South African writer, Herman Charles Bosman. Okay, he was born and brought up in Cape Town. He came from an Afrikaans family, but was bilingual in English as well. He graduated from Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, went to teach in the Western Transvaal amongst a community which was very austere Afrikaans families, a little bit like the Amish people in Pennsylvania, so very traditional, and they had particular attitudes towards black Africans. The British were oppressors. Women were there to do duties which would help men. But they're all told through the character of Umshot Lorenz, who has a rather cynical attitude towards the society. And you can imagine him as you read these. He is sitting there on his stoop, his veranda of his house, smoking his pipe with a glass of peach brandy, which was the favourite drink of theirs, to hand. But he's well known within the stories of being a great storyteller. He actually got into a bit of trouble because when he returned once to Johannesburg, he got in an argument with his stepbrother, shot him and killed him. And in fact, he was sentenced to death, which was commuted to 10 years hard labour. He served 5, but then left South Africa, came to live in England. And in fact, most of his writing was done in England. I do recommend you to read those. You'll love them. But it's probably best if you have a little sense or feeling of what South African society is like.
And some peach brandy.
Peach brandy. Okay.
We're on for that.
Well, my final one, and I'm overrunning. Okay. My final one is a Norwegian family who came to live in Cardiff. And I think we all begin to know who that is. Okay? Father died 2 or 3 years after they arrived here, and one of the daughters also died. But Mrs. Dahl, with her son, Roald, named after Amundsen, the famous explorer, stayed on. And they'd come to England, or come to Britain, because he was very keen, the father was very keen on English education, which he thought was the best in the world. So mother stayed on to have him educated here, and he went to Repton School, where he was mercilessly bullied and caned. And he always developed this idea of a revenge and retribution, which actually goes through a lot of his books. Not the children's books, well, even some of the children's books, actually. He served in the RAF for 2 years at the beginning of the war, was invalided out, went and worked for the the British Embassy in Washington. He started to write children's stories then, and actually, one of his fellow diplomats gave some of the stories to Eleanor Roosevelt, and she used to read them to her children. And that sort of put him on the map a bit. But he then went on to write, mostly while he was in America, for Collier's, for Harper's, and so on. Now, I absolutely adore Roald Dahl. I'm not so fond of his children's books because I didn't read them, to be honest. I didn't read them to my children. But I just love the twist at the end of every story. And I think, of our age, he is just the absolute master. And it says at the bottom here, the observer, the absolute master of the twist in the tale. And I think he really is. Okay. So that's my 12. There we are. I have to say that having made my list, I then realised that there were no women on it.
No, I was just about to ask you that.
And I think
Are they too domestic?
I think probably so. I think possibly they're not evil enough. I think they make observations about society. So if you take, of course, the most famous is Catherine Mansfield, I suspect. Okay, I don't know whether you saw in the paper today that some people want to take her back to be buried in New Zealand. She absolutely hated New Zealand. She thought it was the end of the world because she lived most of her life here. I find her stories a bit bland. When I read them,